Quiet friends. I have a tale to tell before the tavern closes tonight. I have come a very long way, and seen so many places. I've heard many stories, and I am happy to be here now to share them with you. So, gather round. Tonight is a special night. We are celebrating the birthday of the first good Belgrave king, William Beckren, the flower knight of the Wild Kingdom, whose bravery and mercy turned our once sorrowful nation into a place that is home to many outcasts. Because of him, none who call Belgraveld home are truly alone. So I figured tonight I could tell you his story. However, this tale is a long one, so we will likely have to break it up into multiple nights. Our good king's life began here, in the Waywind Mountains, in a town called Kazant, to the southwest of where we are today. His father was the town's scapin, guiding his people and caring for each and every one of them as best he could. Will's mother fell ill when he was born, so Will and his father would spend their free time tending to her whenever possible, though she had always wished that Will would be out in the world instead of tending to her. As he aged, he joined the town's small garrison to protect it from bandits and beasts alike. However, he often found the work incredibly dull. He didn't see the point in trying to make sure that people with barely any coins to their names paid taxes, and he certainly didn't understand why it was a crime if you failed to pay. This troubled him, so he asked his father about it. His father explained that taxes go to the king, and from there the king uses it to build armies and enact acts of diplomacy or public service. Will thought this was odd. The people of Kazant were farmers and miners primarily, and if the metal and crops they sent to the capital could not be sold to make coins, what was the point of making it? He knew the surrounding villages did much the same work. Surely 100 farms and 100 mines could feed the people and also work as a form of export. This began Will's education in politics. His father would teach him diplomacy, writing, and the few other languages he could teach. Will took up the task of aiding the townsfolk with hammers and nails instead of just the sword at his side. He helped with the harvest and fielded people's needs whenever he had a spare moment. By the time Will turned 16, he decided on his path in life. Kazant would not hold him forever, so he kissed his mother for the last time, hugged his father, and headed to the eastern coast. After a season of walking, he finally made his way to the proving ground of the Tournament of Trees. He knew victory would see him knighted, and therefore eligible for service to noble houses as more than just a foot soldier. When he signed up, they gave him a red tabard to signify his heritage, a commoner of the Waywind Mountains. He was ecstatic, greeting his fellow competitors and making friends among them. However, one person did not like Will much. He was a large elf from somewhere in the north, born of a noble family and raised with a deep distaste for commoners. He competed for honor, and saw Will competing for the farce of pretending to be a noble one day. The elf, a man named Sverka, approached Will, tailed by an entourage of nobles much like himself. He figured he could make Will quit right now. The men ambushed good King Beckren, beating him savagely behind a tent using their shields and the flats of their swords. Will came out bloody and bruised with an arm that hurt to move. Sverka and his friends moved on, assuming they had scared him away. That night, while sitting beside a fire in the camp around the proving ground, Will painted his shield with a pair of roses, one white and one red. He still joked with the other competitors, but his eyes never left Sverka in the distance. It felt wrong that Sverka could cheat without punishment, simply because he had enough coins to make problems go away. Will would remember that. The next morning, the tournament began. There were many events going on, and to qualify for the final tournament he would need 40 points. He worried that his wounds from the previous night would bar him from anything too taxing. Events like wrestling and armored combat were not options he had, and archery was not a skill he possessed in the slightest, so almost all of those events weren't an option either. He then noticed a young man with black hair and tan skin. His long ears and blue and green eyes revealed him to be a coastal elf. Beckren saw the man asking a varietal of competitors if they would like to be his partner for the duo event, and all simply ignored him due to his smaller stature. Will decided that this would be his gamble. Upon introducing himself, Will and the elf made fast friends. He learned the elf's name was Miguel, and that he had never actually been in a fight before. Will didn't see this as an issue, and so the two signed up for the duos event. Will checked his sword and tested his mobility in his shield arm as they waited for their first bout. Miguel simply watched the clouds and hummed a song to himself. The duo event in the Tournament of Trees is a simple event. Any melee weapon is allowed, 4 combatants in teams of 2, each fight to surrender or death. To win it, gets each member of the 2-man team 20 points. So if they could win this, the remaining points required to make it into the final tourney would be a cinch. Their first fight was against a duo of dwarves, one short, the other giant. The mountain dwarf was 10.5 hands tall, wielding a poleaxe. The giant clan dwarf was 22.5 hands tall, and held an axe and shield. As the 4 squared off on the proving ground, the crowd roaring and cheering, Will offered them both luck, and gave them a kind smile. It was then that he noticed that Miguel didn't have a weapon. Will didn't see this as an issue. As the fight began, Will made sure to catch the giant's attention first, attempting to keep Miguel safe. With every swing of his axe, Will chose to dodge instead of block. With his arm in the state it was in, he was certain he couldn't fully deflect a blow. This angered the giant, who started to swing harder and faster. Will kept his footing, but he knew he would have to come up with a better option soon. Suddenly, the crowd roared with delight. Will caught from the corner of his eye that Miguel had completely exhausted the mountain dwarf. Every swing he took somehow missed, as though the wind itself had carried the weapon aside at the last second. Miguel did not seem surprised by this. Will decided to refocus his efforts and took to the offensive. He started taking quick slashes with his one-handed sword, simply to see if the giant was quick enough to block him, which he often was. So it continued, Will dodging and taking slashes that got quickly brushed away. They fell into a rhythm. Dodge, dodge, slash. Dodge, dodge, slash. After a few moments of this, Will decided his enemy was comfortable enough, and stepped closer into the giant's guard, swinging a single punch with his sword arm, striking the giant in the cheek with the pommel of his weapon. The giant staggered and fell onto his rear. Will gave him a smile through his heavy breaths, and the giant man simply laughed, surrendering with a smile and walking off of the grounds. Seemingly the mountain dwarf had quit out of frustration a while ago. And so it went for 5 fights. Will would greet his adversaries with a smile, and then bid them good luck. Miguel's luck would protect him from harm until his enemy simply decided to surrender out of frustration, and Will would win in a few non-lethal blows with his pommel and his shield. This was enough to win 20 points for both men. That night they celebrated. Will asked Miguel, over a cup of mulled wine, how he managed to do that. And the coastal elf just shrugged with a coy smile. He said he had always just been lucky. The next morning, they had to pick their next event. Will was feeling better, but he still didn't trust his chances in one-on-one duels with a wounded arm. Him and Miguel pondered what to do when they spotted a Nobix of the clan Feline. She was a lioness, with fur painted with blue patterns. In her hand she held a curved sword, and she seemingly was in the same conundrum as Will and Miguel. They asked if she would join their team for a trios event, and she agreed. Will and Miguel fought as usual. However, the feline, named Sarissa, would use her blade with lightning-quick accuracy. She would swing a cut towards an opponent and cut the sleeve from their shirt, only ever drawing just a bit of blood. With her help, they cleared their 6 matches with absolute ease. Will would greet his enemies and wish them luck. And with that, they had secured their placement in the real tournament. The 3 sat around the fire, drinking and laughing. Sarissa told them that she was from the Kianmei Isles to the south, where her people are slightly more common. She had learned to use her blade in the service of a band of entertainers, cutting necklaces from necks without a nick, and throwing knives blindfolded at the crowd of amazed customers. She wanted to be more, so she came here. Will felt a strange feeling in his heart. He liked his new friends, however, none of them had truly proven themselves as warriors here. They had simply shown that they knew some fancy tricks. He promised both of them that by the time they meet in the real tournament, he wouldn't hold back, and he didn't want them to either. The following morning, his first fight of the day was against Miguel. The nonplussed elf smiled and gave Will a hug before the fight began. Will wished him luck. As the fight began, Will approached slowly. Miguel simply stood still, his hands behind his back. Will took a test swing, and true to form, the wind picked up and redirected the blade by just a hair, leaving Miguel unbothered. Will wheeled his blade around and nodded. Miguel simply laughed. Good King Beckren swung his blade to the side, perfectly leveled at Miguel's hip, and yet again a gust of wind forced the blade directly down into the dirt. Will picked his sword back up and nodded again. He noticed that every time the wind picked up, Miguel's eyes would move in the direction the wind would come from. That was enough information. Will swung his sword straight down towards Miguel's shoulder, and as the wind picked up, he lifted his shield arm and punched Miguel directly in the cheek. Miguel stumbled and put his hand on his cheek, smiling and nodding with a shrug, surrendering to the first person to ever get through his barrier of luck, our good king. Will hugged his friend and promised him a drink later. However, Will's next fight was against Sarissa. Before the bout, Will greeted her and wished her luck. This fight proved harder. She was lightning quick and could position her blade for a perfect cut with ease. Will struggled to keep up, lifting his shield to protect his body only moments before each strike would land. He almost never had time to throw one of his own. That's when he noticed her footwork. Sarissa was no soldier. She was a performer, and though she could swing with deadly accuracy and speed, she didn't know how to hold her weight for a retreat. So, Will pressed his position, stepping into her guard and shouldering her in the chest. She fell to the ground, and he lowered his blade. However, she got back up and the fight continued. Will would eventually win, but with every time Sarissa stood, she adapted her posture, getting better and better at dodging his attacks. She only surrendered because she decided Will deserved the win. So he continued to fight, realizing as the tournament went on that Sverka had seemingly paid his way into the later rounds of the tournament. Accomplished and gifted warriors would simply miss a swing or drop their weapon before being brutalized to the amazement of the crowd. Will was unbothered by this. Soon enough they reached the end of the tournament, and it came to Will Beckren of Belgravelt and Sverka the elven noble. Before the fight began, Sverka and Will met before the crowd. The elven noble whispered to Will to throw the fight in exchange for more gold than Will had ever seen before. Will just looked to the elf and winked. No greeting, and no bidding him good luck. Sverka carried a two-handed sword. On his hips he had a mace and a dagger. Will walked to his side of the pitch and stuck his sword into the ground, resting his shield against it. Sverka figured this was Will's way of obstinately agreeing to the bribe and began his approach. Will stretched his neck and his arms. Sverka prepared to swing his longsword at Will's waist, and Beckren just stepped in closer, punching Sverka directly across the jaw. He was feeling much better now. Sverka growled in pain and went in for a thrust with his longsword, but Will simply stepped aside and in one step closer, before throwing another punch directly towards Sverka's nose. By now the elf was enraged and began to swing at Will more rapidly, no longer going for a gentle win, now simply trying to kill him. Will kept his feet moving, outpacing Sverka by staying at the edge of his range. This drove Sverka to cheat. He whistled, calling his noble friends to just storm the field and kill Beckren. The tournament's officials allowed it to happen. At the very least, it was good entertainment. If Will won, he truly deserved it. And if Sverka won, he would be taunted by the other nobles of his nation for being a coward. Will noticed the men rushing towards him with their maces and swords and decided now was probably the time to take this seriously. Sverka was the most important threat, as he was closest, so Will stepped into his guard and threw him to the ground as hard as he could, winding the noble elf before stomping on his wrist to disarm him. Will kicked his sword away as he watched the other three nobles begin to encircle him. These men weren't warriors. They were pigs who paid for victory. Will didn't have anything to fear from them. They would swing too wide, making it easier to dodge their attacks. They wouldn't pay attention to their surroundings, allowing Will to push them into one another and interrupt their attacks. Best of all, they barely even knew how to protect themselves. Will spent minutes making a mockery of them. Sverka soon stood and told his men to leave, realizing now that he would have to save face in this situation. He moved to throw his arms up in surrender, and Will simply wandered over to his shield and sword. Will had won. As such, he was granted a parcel of land in Belgravelt and the title of Sir William Beckren, the Flower Knight of the Waywind Mountains. He watched Sverka limp away with his lackeys and rejoined his friends. The three celebrated into the night, drinking and laughing together. The next morning, Miguel and Sarissa departed. Will would miss them, but this would not be the last time they met. As Will readied his new horse to leave, a man approached him, wearing a cloak of red and orange and a crown of gold. Will knelt before the king of Belgravelt, King Jan Rierank, and the two men spoke for a while. King Rierank eventually asked if Will would like to join his army. Will happily accepted, but King Rierank would not be in power for long, as he would be replaced by his son, the king that banished the Nobiks of Belgravelt, a tale I have told you before from their perspective. Will had served King Rierank III for 15 years, and when his son took over, Will immediately didn't care for him. He had fought wars for Belgravelt, and worked closely with the king on ways to care for the already ailing people of the Rainy Mountains. He had gained the trust of his fellow soldiers, so when they were given a new king who was a bigot, a bully, a man who took everything he could and gave nothing back, the knights turned to Will Beckren. When Tuck Troublefoot freed the Nobiks, Will made it clear he would no longer stand it. After the Nobiks left, Will and the other knights of Belgravelt decided to banish King Riorank IV from the Waywind Mountains. Will had pondered who the new king would be, but when he turned to face the knights and the soldiers of the Belgrav army, they had already made up their minds. Will Beckren became our king, and our nation only grew stronger under his guidance and grace. For now, that's where I will end this tale, for Will's reign was long and filled with adventures. When we meet next, I would like to tell you of another Belgravelt hero, but one you likely have never heard of, a Waywatcher, a wandering hero who guides the lost through our rainy mountains. Until then, I have a tome of tales from every nation to share with you all. I have seen many monsters, many heroes. I have learned of the magic offered by the gods, and the magic humans can conjure for themselves. I have seen warfare, and I have tales of peace. I cannot wait to share them all with you. Good night, and thank you.
Legends of Lorelei is a narrative fiction podcast by Livewire Multimedia Stories. The Bard is voiced and created by Gwen Fulman, who can be found as @Gwen_Fulman on Instagram. Written by Gwen Fulman. Co-executive produced by Gwen Fulman and Elizabeth Fulman, with music by Gwen Fulman. If you enjoyed what you just listened to, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/Livewire Multimedia Stories. There, you will get exclusive access to early episodes and fun perks, like access to polls and our Discord server, where we collaborate on projects and resources, share fan art, and just hang out. If you like this project and would like to learn more about it or any of our other projects, please follow us on social media. We are on Tumblr @Livewire Media, on Instagram @Livewire Multimedia, and on YouTube @Livewire Multimedia Stories. But really, the best way to support us is to share this with a friend. Thank you for listening.